Hello and welcome to TransForm Tuesday. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services at Alpha Software. And today on TransForm Tuesday, we're going to be talking about reporting. But just to make sure I don't make the same mistake I made last week, I'd like to make sure that my screen is actually showing. So if someone would be nice enough in the questions window to type in whether or not they can hear me and see my screen, that would be great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Great. Well, let's begin. All right, so I'm going to start down here. Reporting. Now, we've done reporting as a TransForm Tuesday in the past. I'm actually going to start back there and just do a quick review over what we discussed. But today we're going to take it a little bit further, because what we needed to do in the old days, and sometimes we still do, was we had to do some coding in order to do the reporting. But today we have a method that's, thanks to some advances that have happened in the last probably 6 months, where you could do reporting in Alpha Anywhere against transform data without doing any coding whatsoever. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about some of the different techniques that you might do when you're doing reporting in order to make your reports run faster. So let's go back into the past. I think it was way back here. Slide 36, I think. Here we go. Alpha Transform and the Alpha Anywhere report writer. So what this was, and I'm just going to go through this quickly because we do have a recorded session about this, but I had built in a previous TransForm Tuesday an example in which invoice data were collected using TransForm. And that invoice data was then exported as a report in Alpha Anywhere. Almost everyone on the call, I think, is familiar with Alpha Anywhere. If you're not, Alpha Anywhere is a companion product to Alpha Transform. It is a low-code programming environment, and it runs on a server. So let's just show you a couple examples of what we could do here. What I did was I built out a transform form, and I had to collect the basic things that you would put on an invoice, like a customer's name and their address, as well as the products that they purchased, the quantity in which they purchased them, as well as the name of the product and the price, so that later on we could do calculations on it. I then went and collected the data, and here was an example of the collected data. For example, here is a record for the customer Ingrid Andrews, and she bought four things, an HDMI cable, a monitor, a splitter, and another couple of shorter cables. So then what we did is we created a new data source, and here's where we had to do a little bit of programming. Our custom data source in Alpha Anywhere required that we do coding that spit back a JSON object that the report writer could use. And the report writer, and so we created a special function for that called getInvoiceData. And the pseudocode for getInvoiceData was basically get the data from the Transform API, format the data so just the relevant JSON is left, and then pass the JSON back and return the value. And I went in and explained how you could use the open Transform API, the Transform API Explorer to help build out that code. Here we tested it, and if you could just click the Xbasic button here, it would show you the code that you needed to do, and that would handle part of the programming task. Then I sort of walked through the rest of what was required and how we took some hierarchical data and we flattened it down into flat data so that it was ready for the report writer. Now, our new functions in Alpha Transform still don't deal with hierarchical data. So if you're doing a hierarchical set of reporting, you're still going to probably have to do a little bit of coding to flatten your data, but it won't be quite as much. Anyway, to finish the example, I had put together a report using the Alpha Anywhere report writer. I laid out the fields, and then I ran the report, and it came out with something like this. Now today we're going to do an even simpler report. Let me jump way ahead here. And today what we're going to do is do a report that we would like to do for our Alpha Field Services application. If you've been following along, we've been building out a test case called the Alpha Field Services application. It's an Alpha Anywhere application that runs with TransForm. And it lets you do a bunch of things. It has a dashboard, which is the view that you see here, but it also has a reports section called reports, which right now is just a placeholder of fake reports that we built. Now, what we knew was we wanted to build a report that measured the performance each day of how well the business as a whole was at closing tickets. So in other words, in this fictional field services company, when a van gets sent out into the field and it shows up at a customer location to perform a repair, how many times, what percentage of the times did they get that repair right the first time and didn't have to come back? In other words, they're able to resolve it. They, for example, had the parts in stock, they knew what they were doing, they were able to get in to the building, whatever might be an obstacle, they were able to deal with that day. So in order to do that, we had a couple of options for bringing that data into the report writer. So here are the two methods that I'd like to talk about. The first was method one, and method one is the one that I used. It's actually the one we're going to use again today, and it's the one that we used in the past in our first reporting session. And basically all we do is we make an API call from Alpha TransForm, and we feed that data right into the report writer, and the report writer creates a report. Method two, which is a little bit more advanced, has to do with using ETL, extract, transfer, and load. And that was a topic that we covered the last two sessions. With ETL, the data from Alpha TransForm is first placed into a SQL table, and then it's used by the report writer. The reason you would do this is because it is way faster. First of all, the Alpha TransForm itself, if you can imagine, has a database built into it that when you make an API call, it then has to go and do a database query and send you back all of the records. And APIs are fine for transferring data, but for transferring lots of data really fast, there's really nothing that beats a SQL database. So our suggestion would be, if you're dealing with thousands of records, and in today's example, we are dealing with thousands of records, you're probably going to want to load it into a SQL table anyway, using the ETL methods that I described over the previous weeks. Okay, so let's get started on building this out. We're going to use it still. We're going to use still method one. We're not going to do ETL in this one. I just want to show you what's possible. So this method is perfectly suitable if you're not dealing with a ton of records, if you're dealing with hundreds as opposed to many, many thousands. And also, I do suspect that we are going to make the API for this type of work faster in the future so that you may not even have to do this ETL piece. So let's jump into it. Imagine in Alpha Anywhere, you're building a new report. And when you create a new report, you used to have a couple of options. One was, when it came to the data source, one was a SQL data source, where you use a connection string and you point it to a SQL table or a SQL view, or a custom, SQL select statement. The other was custom data source, and that's the one that we went over many months ago when we talked about creating a JSON object to pass into the report writer using API data from TransForm. And then, and this is a holdover from last time, if you had DBF tables, you could report against them as well. But since last time, we've introduced this new option called TransForm, which means I'd like this report to be based on a TransForm form. So if you select that option, it's going to ask you a couple of things. First of all, not surprisingly, it's going to ask you for the form ID. And then second of all, it's going to ask you for the API key. The API key, as you know, allows your software to talk to the API through the internet to grab data. And you can get those APIs right out of TransForm Central, which I'm going to show you right here. Here's TransForm Central. You basically just go down to the Get API Key section. For reporting, all you need to do is use read data as the option for the API key. The API key does not need any other permissions than that. So I would suggest for security, only using the read data option here when you're doing a reporting. A lot of the other examples that I had shown before, a lot of the ETL examples did require all, but this time we just require read data. Great, so once I had selected that, the API key and the form ID, instead of selecting the all fields option, which is checked by default, I unchecked that option and clicked here in fields so that I could choose the individual fields that I want in my report. There are two reasons to do this. One is, I presume, although I haven't tested it, that it is in fact quicker to get back a smaller data set. And so just choosing those particular fields would be all that we need. The second thing is that it makes it easier in the report writer if you don't have a lot of extraneous fields that you don't need. When you're laying it out, it's much easier to have a palette of fields that include only the fields that you want. So I used the select fields option and chose the ones that we wanted. And then that brought me here and I designed a report just like this. And this is a really, really simple report. All I wanted to do was for each day, I wanted to list out each of the companies that had been serviced, what time the technician showed up, and whether or not it was resolved or not resolved. Then for each day, I wanted to do a summary in which I averaged the amount of times that it was resolved and come up with a percentage. And I think I'm going to show that in the next one. Yeah, here's the next one. So for example, on March 18th, here are all of the companies. Notice they all have Latin names because they're all fake data. And here's some of them were resolved, some of them weren't resolved. But at the bottom, I got to see what percentage was what. So let's get out of PowerPoint for a minute and jump right into Alpha Anywhere. And I'm going to show you a couple of little details about how to put together something like this for your own summary reporting against TransForm data. So here I am in Alpha Anywhere, and here's the, this is a live preview of what we're looking at. I can move from page to page. One thing that is nice about the report writer is that while it took a while for the report writer to open and load in the data from the TransForm API. And by a while, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There are a little over 4,000 records that needed to be loaded in here, and that probably took a little bit over a minute in order to do that. Now, a minute isn't a huge deal if you're a designer. You can wait a minute before laying out a report. But as someone who's running the report, you don't want to do that. And that's probably why is the best argument for using ETL rather than connecting directly to TransForm. However, once you're the designer and you do load in that data, it's actually really quick to make changes to your report and to preview your report. You don't have to wait for that data to get loaded in each time. It's really just as quick as that. So if you see I go click, 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 I'm going page, 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 page. And here we go. And in each time we've calculated out a percentage. So let me show you how that's done, because I think the report writer creates confusion for a lot of people. And it's actually, while it's very powerful, it's not necessarily that hard to use once you learn a few tricks and techniques, which I'm going to show you right now. So let's go over here to the web project. I'm sorry, back to the, I'm going to close this preview and I'm going to go back into the designer. And so here's the designer. This is a banded report writer. If you're familiar with Crystal Reports, it's similar to a system like Crystal Reports. And what you can do in a banded report writer is you can create these bands, in other words, these groupings. By default, when you create a new report, there are only three bands. There's the report header, and there's the report footer, and in the middle is the detail. The report header appears once at the top of the report. The report footer appears once at the bottom of the report, and the detail appears once for each record that that the report processes. So if you listed out 4,000 records, you're going to have 4,000 detail sections, usually stacked one on top of another, which is what we've done here. Now you'll see there's some other bands besides the three. There's actually a group band, and that's because I wanted to see statistics on a day-by-day basis. I didn't want to see the entire data set. I wanted to see day by day. So in order to do day by day, I created a group, and I'll show you how I set that up. What I did was I clicked the Insert Group button up here. I think you can even do that at the details section. You can do Insert Group. And when I did that, I was presented with these properties. It asks me what I would like to break on. In other words, how would I like to have this stuff grouped? What am I going to group it by? And so I chose, instead of a particular field, I chose an expression. And I chose the expression of service date. But I used this little function here called convert type to convert it into a date. Here's why I did that. All of the data that you're going to get back from TransForm as a web service in JSON format, it may represent a date, but it's always going to come back as a character value. So if you sort dates based on character values, you're not going to get the answers that you're looking for. Using the American date format, for example, it would put, since we do month, day, year, it would put all the Januaries next to each other. So January 2019 would be followed by January 2020, and it would miss February, March, all the way through December. So it's important that you convert the type to what you want when you're doing the break. So that's all I did was I took my date and told it convert type into a date, and that's all there was to it. Then what I did was I took the service date and I created and I basically just plunked it up here at the top so I could see what date that group was for. This is in the group header section of my report. Now in the details section, remember that's the section that repeats over and over again for each record, I put in the service date again, the company, and the status, what's called the new status. New status is a field that comes from TransForm, and it includes, it's a field that I created as part of the form. It's not a system field or a meta field. And it's recorded in the field by the technician. They either choose that it was resolved or it needs review. I think there are a couple other statuses as well, but by and large, it's just those two. And I was really interested to know just cases in which they were resolved. So I wanted to, at the very end, figure out how to do a percentage of that. And so what I did was I created something called a calculated field. So calculated fields, which you can get to right up here in this little XY calculated field section, are a place where you can build a field that isn't field that came in from the data, but the field that is calculated from field that came in from the data. And in particular, don't get scared off by this one. This was actually written by the system. I created this guy here, this field called resolved. And resolved is defined using an if statement. The if is, if the new status is equal to resolved, then resolved, the variable, should be set to the value of 1. Otherwise, it should be set to the value of 0. So if it's resolved, 1, if not, 0. So each time this detail section is generated, the number, if I were to place that resolved field here, would either be a 0 or a 1. A 1 if it's resolved, a 0 if it's not. So then what I did is I came down here into the group break and I grabbed my resolved field. Let me just move these controls out of the way. Okay. Grab my resolved calculated field and I dragged it and I put it right up here into the detail section. Into the group footer section. When I did that, this dialog box appeared and it asked me, okay, I can put that in, but what do you want? Do you want me to do something with that data? Do you want me just to show you what the value was, the last value that came through, which would either be a 1 or a 0? That wouldn't be particularly helpful. Would you like to do a total? Well, that's really not what we're looking for. What we were looking for was an average. So I plonk in average. Oops, I've already have a field name that. Let me give it a different name. And there's my field. Now, if I were to run this right now or preview it, which I'm going to do. Okay, preview. Shoot. All right, not working. If I were to preview it right now, what you would see would be a number that ranged somewhere between 0 and 1. It would only average 1 if every single one of the ones in the detail section was a 1. If everyone was a 0, it would be a 0, otherwise it would be somewhere in between. So what I did then with that was I modified that field because I didn't want to see some fraction. I wanted to see a percentage. So I modified that field. Here's a copy of that field that I had made before, so I can show this to you. And I go into properties, and then I said, okay, here's the expression. This part of it was put in for me automatically when I dropped the field. But since I wanted to turn it into a percentage, I needed to multiply it times 100. So I just said asterisk 100. And that's all it took to actually do to convert it into a percentage. The second thing I did is I went over into, I think it's format. Yeah, it's the format section. And I told it what style. I told it I wanted to use this style, the style which has got a percentage mark after it. And then I told it the display format. I said I didn't actually need 4 decimal places because it's never going to be more than 3, but I put 4 decimal places. And if I wanted to, I could say, for as the width of the format. In other words, it's not going to go above 100%, no matter how good you are as a service company. But you can also do decimal places if you wanted to get really exact. That didn't really make sense for this particular report, so I left that as 0. And so then when I ran it, and since this isn't running here, let me just hop back over to PowerPoint. What I ended up with was something like this. This is where it says 75% of everything on this day was completed. So I hope that's given you a little bit of the background about putting together reports. Just as a quick review, you can now use TransForm as an actual data source directly in Alpha Anywhere. Let me find it. The reason you might not want to do this is if you have a lot of records, it does take a while for the report to run because it needs to do basically double the amount of work. You need to call to TransForm to get the data. The TransForm needs to call to a database to get the data, then it needs to send it back to Alpha Anywhere. You're much better off following the ETL techniques if you're dealing with a large set of data, like I had explained before, extract, transfer, and load, which I think was back here. So that was a couple weeks ago I went over this, in which you'll take the data and put it into a SQL table first. Actually, I have a better slide here. Here it is. You're much better off going this way because there's going to be no delay for your users when you're running it. The next thing I did was I put together a report. I selected the fields. Now, whether you're selecting the fields, if you're choosing a SQL data source, you also get to select the fields. I like to choose just the fields that I need because it keeps the design environment less cluttered and because it's quicker to get the data back. And then I laid out the fields and I created a group so that I could group it for each one of the days. And importantly, when I did that group, I used the convert date type function, convert type function to convert it into a date because everything I get back from TransForm is going to be in character status. So if there are any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. All right, let's see what we got. Sure, here's someone requesting a topic for a future TransForm Tuesday. You saw an email, which Nikos had a video. Nikos is one of our product managers here and solutions engineers who works a lot with Alpha TransForm. And he showed an example with a spreadsheet with calculations converted into an offline mobile application. So yeah, I will talk to Nikos and get that example, and I could do that as a future TransForm Tuesday. That's a great suggestion. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Is there anything else? If there's nothing else, then that is it. Hey, thank you very much. I'm going to be away at a trade show next week, so I'm not going to be doing a TransForm Tuesday next week. We'll have one the week after that. I'll also be joined, for those of you who show up to the Wednesday webinars, Dion will be joining me, but we may actually do that webinar live from our trade show, since it will be in Austin, Texas, Dion's hometown. So thanks very much for joining me, and I hope to see you 2 weeks from today. Take care and goodbye. And also, if you have any questions, send them to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. Thanks again.